The taste of power. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and comment, because after hearing this story, you'll never look at food the same way again. It started with a video. A grainy clip leaked from a maximum security prison in Venezuela. A shaky shot of inmates lined up for what looked like soup. Only it wasn't soup. It was boiling water with a single piece of bread floating in it. Within hours, the footage hit the internet, sparking global outrage. How can they serve that? Someone commented. They should be fed like humans, not animals. But others fired back. They're criminals. They don't deserve better. What most people didn't know was that this wasn't just about one meal. It was about a war, one fought quietly through hunger, corruption, and control. And at the center of it all was a man named Miguel El Sombra Carrillo, a drug trafficker who turned prison food into his weapon of power. Miguel had ruled the streets of Caracas with an iron fist, but when he was finally caught after a decade-long chase across 3 countries, he thought his empire was over. What he didn't realize was that Ramo Verde prison, the place he was sent, would become his new throne. At first, Miguel was just another inmate in a sea of orange uniforms. The food was worse than he'd ever imagined. Watery beans, moldy rice, and portions so small they could fit in a child's hand. But Miguel noticed something others didn't. The kitchen staff had more power than anyone else. They controlled hunger, and hunger controlled men. One night, when most inmates were asleep, Miguel slipped a guard a gold watch through the bars, a simple trade for a favor. "Let me talk to the cook," he whispered. The next morning, the prison kitchen had a new assistant, Miguel himself. Within weeks, he'd learned every recipe, every supplier, and every hole in the supply chain. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, in a Swedish prison outside Stockholm, another story was unfolding. One that couldn't have been more different. At Kumla Prison, considered one of the most humane correctional facilities in the world, inmates woke to fresh bread, scrambled eggs, and fruit. Their lunch trays included fish, rice, and vegetables, food that could have come from a family cafeteria. The idea, officials said, was simple. Dignity leads to rehabilitation. One inmate, Johan Lindberg, convicted of embezzlement, had written a book titled Behind Bars, Beyond Taste, describing his culinary experiences inside. "They feed us like men, not monsters," he wrote. And somehow, that changes how we see ourselves. His book became a sensation, a rare glimpse into a system that valued reform over punishment. When journalists compared Johan's story with Miguel's leaked footage from Venezuela, the contrast was staggering. Rich country prisons fed inmates better than millions of free citizens in poorer nations. But for Miguel, food had become something else, not nourishment, but dominance. As weeks turned into months, Miguel's influence grew. He smuggled in spices, meat, even contraband salt, luxuries in Ramo Verde. He made deals with guards, traded meals for favors, and controlled rations like a banker controls money. Soon, everyone owed him something. Inmates who defied him didn't starve, not literally. But their food arrived cold, moldy, or forgotten. The warden noticed, of course. Reports crossed his desk. Rumors spread of a food boss. But when investigators inspected the kitchen, everything looked normal. No stolen supplies, no missing food. Miguel was too smart for that. The real genius of his plan was that he never took more, he just decided who got what. By the second year, the prison was no longer run by guards, it was run by hunger. Miguel had built a kingdom of loyalty, one meal at a time. And outside the walls, international agencies were beginning to take notice. NGOs investigating prison conditions across Latin America started connecting dots: corruption, malnutrition, and inmate control. But one report stood out: a 17-page file written by an American criminologist named Dr. Elise Monroe. She had been studying global prison diets for 5 years. Her conclusion was damning. In nations where food becomes punishment, prisons become breeding grounds for tyranny. Elise was determined to expose the truth, not just about Ramo Verde, but about how food was being used to control inmates around the world. She compared budgets, from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons to Kenya's Ministry of Corrections. The numbers didn't lie. In some wealthy nations, the government spent up to $8 per inmate meal. In others, less than 50 cents. When Elise's findings reached the press, public outrage exploded. Headlines read, "Prisons feeding inmates worse than refugee camps." But what no one knew was that Miguel, from behind bars, was feeding the chaos on purpose. He began leaking photos and fake reports to activist networks, creating the illusion of mass starvation. Every post, every protest added to his legend. He wasn't just surviving prison. He was manipulating global attention. He wanted to show that power didn't depend on freedom. Then one night, Elise received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're studying the wrong prisons." Attached was a video clip, shaky, dimly lit, but unmistakable. Miguel himself, sitting in a cell, surrounded by food, smiling into the camera. He raised a spoon and said, "In rich countries, food reforms prisoners. In poor ones, it rules them." And then the screen went black. But embedded in the video was something no one had noticed, a single frame that showed a code, carved into the wall behind him. Elise zoomed in. Numbers. Coordinates. Somewhere far from Caracas. Her hands trembled as she realized what she was looking at. They weren't just numbers. They were directions to where the next video would be filmed. And that meant one terrifying thing. Someone outside the prison was working for Miguel. The coordinates of control. By the time the coordinates leaked, Ramo Verde had turned from a prison into a fortress of secrets. Guards whispered Miguel's name like a ghost story, El Sombra, the shadow, the man who ruled with hunger instead of guns. And outside those cracked concrete walls, the world was beginning to notice him not as an inmate, but as an idea. When Dr. Elise Monroe traced the coordinates, she expected to find another prison, maybe a supply warehouse, perhaps even a political office. Instead, what she found was stranger. The numbers led to a desolate strip of land in the Colombian mountains, the site of an abandoned military base, once used for humanitarian food storage during the 1980s. It was no longer listed on any active government registry. But satellite images showed something strange: new tire tracks, truck movement, and faint smoke rising from ruins. Someone had reopened it. Elise stared at her computer screen late into the night, the hum of her old desk fan blending with the static of news feeds replaying Miguel's leaked footage. She knew she couldn't go public yet. If she did, the story would vanish behind politics and press denials. She needed proof. So she called in a favor, a journalist she trusted, Tom Greer, who had built a career covering cartel corruption and prison trafficking networks. He'd once survived an ambush in Honduras. This kind of story didn't scare him. "Coordinates in Colombia tied to a Venezuelan inmate," he said, leaning over Elise's laptop. "That's not food corruption. That's logistics. You're looking at a pipeline." A pipeline. The word hung in the air. Tom was right. For months, Miguel had been exchanging rations inside Ramo Verde for influence. But what if he was also trading with someone outside the walls? The prison's food supply had to come from somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, that somewhere was those coordinates. Meanwhile, back in Ramo Verde, Miguel Carrillo sat calmly in the prison kitchen, sipping what looked like coffee but smelled faintly of vinegar. Around him, the other inmates worked silently. The tension was suffocating. Everyone knew that the food line was sacred. Step out of line, speak out of turn, and your tray might come back empty. Miguel's second-in-command, Rafa, leaned in close. "The Americans are sniffing around again," he whispered. Miguel didn't flinch. "Let them. They think they're investigating hunger. They're really feeding it." He smiled faintly, that same unsettling smile seen in his leaked video. At that same moment, across the ocean, another man was making headlines for entirely different reasons. In a maximum security prison in Norway, a convicted murderer named Oscar Jensen was being interviewed by BBC News. He sat in a bright cafeteria, eating salmon and potatoes served on real plates. "They treat us like human beings," Oscar said softly. "I almost forgot what that felt like." The clip went viral within hours. Luxury prison meals sparked debate. The timing was perfect for Miguel. His underground contacts used the story to stoke outrage across Latin America. Hashtags flooded social media comparing first-world prisons and third-world starvation. Every tweet added to his myth, Miguel, the martyr of hunger. But while the world argued over morality, Elise and Tom were already in Colombia, standing before the rusted gates of the abandoned base. The air smelled like dust and diesel. The entrance was marked by bullet holes, old but not ancient. Someone had been here recently. They pushed through the creaking gates. Inside, rows of steel containers stood stacked like tombstones. Most were empty, but one, marked C-17, was locked with a brand-new padlock. Tom pulled a crowbar from his pack. "You really think this connects back to Ramo Verde?" Elise asked. Tom smirked. "There's only one way to find out." The lock snapped. The door groaned open. Inside, they found rows of packaged food, rice, beans, oil, powdered milk. Each bag stamped with the logo of the Venezuelan Ministry of Corrections. Elise froze. This is prison food." Tom pulled out a shipping ledger. The handwriting was messy, but one line stood out. "Batch 4A Ramo Verde. Clearance, MC. MC, Miguel Carrillo." The realization hit them like ice water. The prison's food supply wasn't being smuggled into the prison. It was being exported from it. Miguel had been selling food meant for inmates to the black market and replacing it with cheaper, rotten supplies inside. He was starving prisoners to build an empire outside the walls. Elise stumbled back, horrified. "He's feeding people out there by starving the ones in here." Tom snapped photos, his hands shaking. "We need to get this out now." But before they could leave, they heard a vehicle approaching. Headlights pierced the darkness, 2 jeeps, moving fast. Elise ducked behind a container, clutching her phone. Armed men stepped out, flashlights, scanning the yard. "Search everything," one of them barked in Spanish. He said the Americans might come. Miguel had known. Somehow, even from inside Ramo Verde, he had anticipated their every move. They hid for nearly an hour as the men searched. When the vehicles finally drove off, Tom exhaled shakily. "We're not dealing with an inmate anymore," he muttered. "We're dealing with a system that answers to him." Meanwhile, back at Ramo Verde, a new order had arrived from the ministry. Miguel was to be transferred to a federal facility, a move that should have terrified any inmate. But when the warden informed him, Miguel only grinned. "Transfer me," he said. "Good. Every new prison needs a kitchen." That night, Elise sent her findings to the International Commission on Prison Ethics, an anonymous drop with the files, photos, and coordinates. But when she woke the next morning, the message had vanished. Deleted from her sent folder. Her laptop had been wiped. Only one new message remained. It was from an encrypted address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You still don't understand the menu." And attached was a photo, Miguel, dressed in a clean uniform, boarding a transport van. On the back of the van, spray painted in white, were 2 words that chilled her to the bone. Batch 5. If Batch 4 was food for the outside, what was Batch 5? Elise realized she was now part of the story, and that somewhere between prisons, convoys, and corrupt officials, Miguel was planning something far bigger than rations. The last meal. The morning Miguel Carrillo left Ramo Verde, the air was thick with tension. Inmates lined the courtyard fences, their faces pale behind rusted bars. They'd all heard the rumors that Miguel wasn't being transferred, he was being promoted. The convoy that took him away looked less like a prison transport and more like a state escort. Black SUVs, tinted windows, armed guards with no insignia. He stepped into the van without handcuffs, carrying nothing but a small notebook and a faint smile. By noon, Ramo Verde had gone silent. No fights, no noise, no life. The power cut out just after lunch, and the guards didn't move to fix it. Everyone felt it. The man who controlled the food had left, but somehow, his grip on the prison had not. Thousands of miles away, in a secure compound outside Bogota, Dr. Elise Monroe sat in a borrowed office surrounded by files. The discovery of Batch 4 had shaken her deeply. Every government contact she reached out to told her the same thing. There's no evidence. Stop digging. But she couldn't stop. Not after the message. Not after the words. You still don't understand the menu. So, she started decoding the ledgers again. Every batch number corresponded to a delivery route, every letter a destination. Except one, batch 5. It had no listed route, no location, no expiry date. Just a name scrawled in pencil. Project Host. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't about food anymore. At that same moment, Miguel was being escorted through the gates of San Mateo Federal Penitentiary, one of the most high-tech prisons in South America. Surveillance cameras tracked every movement. Guards rotated every 6 hours, and meals were prepared under strict supervision. At least, that's what the reports claimed. But Miguel didn't seem worried. He walked past the scanners, the dogs, the walls of steel and concrete as if he'd been here before. And, in a way, he had. His influence, his menu, had already reached this place long before he did. Within days, things began to change. The first sign came when the kitchen supervisor was replaced. Then the supplier for dry goods changed. Then, one by one, the guards began eating from the same line as the inmates. It was small, subtle, but in Miguel's world, control always started with hunger. Meanwhile, Tom Greer was preparing to leak their findings. He'd uploaded all the footage, the base, the ledgers, the containers, to a secure drive. But before he could publish, his laptop went dark. Then his phone. Then his entire apartment lost power. He grabbed his backup hard drive and ran for the door. But when he opened it, a man in a gray suit was already waiting outside. "Mr. Greer," the man said, holding an ID badge that didn't quite look real. "We'd like to talk about your research into Venezuelan food corruption." Tom froze. "Who's we?" The man smiled. "Let's just say we don't like our chefs talking out of turn." 2 days later, Elise got a package delivered by courier. No return address. Inside was a single USB drive. The label read, "Final serving." Heart pounding. She plugged it into an isolated computer. The screen flickered, static buzzing for a few seconds before an image appeared. Grainy security footage from inside San Mateo prison. Miguel was sitting in a dining hall, surrounded by inmates. He wasn't eating. He was watching. One by one, prisoners picked up their trays. The camera zoomed in. Every plate looked identical. Rice, beans, stew, except Miguel's. His plate was empty, except for a folded napkin. He opened it, revealing a note. He smiled and looked directly at the camera, as if he knew Elise would be watching. The note read, "Batch 5 is served." And then chaos. Inmates began collapsing. Guards shouted. Alarms blared. The camera shook violently before cutting to black. Elise covered her mouth in horror. The footage resumed a minute later, showing the dining hall now eerily quiet. Every inmate was still. Every tray untouched. Miguel was gone. Later that evening, the Colombian ministry released a statement. An isolated food contamination incident occurred at San Mateo. All necessary measures have been taken. No mention of Miguel. No mention of the dead. But Elise knew better. She'd seen his methods, starvation as leverage, control through scarcity. This was different. This was closure. She traced the signal metadata from the video. The file hadn't come from prison servers. It was uploaded from an unlisted IP address in Switzerland. A week later, encrypted communications between offshore accounts linked to prison food contracts began disappearing. Someone was erasing the entire trail. And then, out of nowhere, Miguel's name resurfaced, not in Latin America, but in Europe. A high-end catering company in London had a new investor under a pseudonym, M. Carillon Holdings. The tagline of the company's website read, "Feeding the Forgotten." Elise stared at the screen for a long time. The logo, a silver plate surrounded by thorns, matched the insignia painted on the van from his last transport. He hadn't escaped prison. He'd expanded it. Now, the world itself was his new cafeteria. The story broke quietly at first. Small online threads connecting the dots between global prison food suppliers and corruption networks. But then a whistleblower leaked more blueprints, bank statements, emails. Miguel's empire was real, sprawling, and invisible. And every contract led back to one chilling truth. For every nation that paid for rehabilitation food programs, another prison somewhere went hungry. Miguel had built the perfect system, a world where hunger itself was currency. The last file Elise received before disappearing contained a single photograph. It showed a dinner table, elegantly set for two. On one plate was a folded napkin, just like before. On the other was a note, written in Miguel's sharp handwriting. You finally understand the menu. No one ever saw Dr. Elise Monroe again. But weeks later, an investigative journalist in France reported a shipment of emergency prison rations arriving under a false name, Batch 6. And inside one of the crates, hidden beneath the sacks of rice, was a note in English. Hunger never dies. It just changes taste. The story ends there. Or maybe it doesn't. Because somewhere in another prison, another kitchen, someone's already waiting for the next delivery. If you think this story was dark, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications, because the truth doesn't end here.